Hey, what's up guys, StaelTek here and welcome to a brand new video. Today we'll be talking about one of the first ever Core i5 quad-core CPUs, the Core i5-760. The question is, can we do gaming in 2020 with this over 10-year-old architecture? Let's find out. So first of all, I would like to apologize for the tight next video. I still think it was a pretty decent video, but maybe 15 minutes was a little bit too long, so I will try my best to simplify this video. The Core i5-760 is actually not the first ever Core i5 CPU. That title will be held for the 750 CPU. However, this is literally the only actual Core i5 Linfield based CPUs I have. Also, keep in mind that this one was released literally months before the Sandy Bridge architecture, which by the way, keep subscribed on my channel, because in January 2021 we will have a 10th anniversary video on the 2500K and the 2600K CPUs. You will not miss that one. What if you wanted to go with the Linfield architecture in general, because this one is exactly the same as the 750, but with a few little tweaks. So in terms of specs, it has 4 cores and 4 threads. It was released in October 2010, so that's like 12-13 months after the 750 CPU, and it was basically an 870 i7 CPU, but without hyper-threading. It has 8 megabytes of cache, it has a clock speed from 2.8 GHz all the way up to 3.5 GHz. That is exactly the same as the Core i7-870. It has a TDP of 95 watts, and that's because it was based on the, at the time still relatively new, 45nm Linfield architecture. It was compatible with LG1156 sockets, so that's the H55 and P55 chipsets. It supports up to 16 GB of 1333 MHz DDR3 memory natively, although you can definitely get more speed out of that. I will talk more about that in a minute or so. And the launch price in 2010 was $210 US. So what is the actual differences between the Core i5-760 and the 750? The main differences are a better revised turbo boost technology, so it could clock even higher at one core workloads, which for some people that matters, at least in terms of technical numbers. It was nice to have. That has been more matured, it has been refined and all that, so those are easier to overclock. Speaking of overclocking, this will also be among the last officially supported Intel CPUs that didn't have a K-SKU CPU or some really expensive stupid Z-series motherboards just to be able to overclock it on. So my Core i5-760 CPU, actually I only paid about $10 for this one, including shipping. Well, I got it delivered to me, so that was actually a little less than 10 bucks. I believe it was $9.50 or whatever. But still, for that 10 bucks, I still think that was a pretty decent little deal there. And considering the prices on AliExpress, for example, I'm actually doing a slightly better deal, but overall it seems to be a very consistent price between 10 and 15 bucks for it, which honestly, considering the age of the chip, that seems to be a pretty reasonable price given that Core 2 quad CPUs, as soon as you move away from the Q6600, those tend to even cost more than the 750 and 760 CPUs, and honestly it's not a whole deal better FPS per dollar, but whatever. Let's talk about overclocking. So the 750, I cannot speak on it because I don't own that one. When I got it to a 1.375 volt V-core on this Asus P55DE motherboard, which by the way is provided by Game Castle, thanks you guys for that, I was able to achieve 4.3 GHz all core with it, and it was rock solid stable. I kind of wanted to try 4.4 GHz, but hey, 4.3 GHz was still a pretty decent speed. Speaking of that, I think we have to go through the benchmarks. So we are testing it with stock clocks, which were between 3.1 and 3.2 GHz all core when it was in games, and we are using 8 GB of DDR3 1600 MHz RAM. So those are running as close as I can to 1600 megahertz. I believe at 4.3 was running like 1540 megahertz or whatever. In terms of the graphics card, I'm using the GeForce 970 with a custom BIOS. It runs at around mid 1400s on the core and I believe 7500 on the memory. So that simulates us a very nicely overclocked GTX 970. And I will talk more about that in terms of graphics card recommendations if you were to either still use this one or if you want to pair it with a, a low budget gaming machine. But with that being said, let's get into some benchmarks. Let's start off with some 3D Mark Time Spy, which usually scales very well with CPU and GPUs. In this case, we got a CPU score of 1808 at stock speeds. With an overclock, we got almost 2600 points. We are off to a good start, but that means nothing without any context to it. So let's move on to some Cinebench R20. At stock speeds, it was doing kinda alright with 674 points multi-core and a 200 point single core score. But overclocked to 4.3 GHz, we got a significantly higher score of over 1000 points in multi-score, but with a less impressive but still good enough 265 for the single core. But let's get into some games, because I'm very sure you will be impressed how well this CPU actually performs in newer games. First off, some GTA 5 at very high settings with softer shadows at 1080p resolution. At stock speeds, it was doing kinda alright, with a 69 FPS average with a 1% low of 38. However, overclocked to 4.3 GHz, we got a significantly higher performance at almost 95 FPS average with a 1% low of just under 50 frames per second. I would like to note that yes, this game was playing significantly smoother with this overclock. Moving on to Red Dead Redemption 2, which is usually not that CPU heavy, but it definitely favors a newer architecture, and that shows. Even at medium settings with the Vulkan API at 1080p resolution, we got an average frame rate of around 40 with a 1% low of 28. Overclocked to 4.3 GHz, it didn't really help much, as we only got up to 47 FPS average with a 1% low of 36. Dirt Rally 2.0 favors a high frequency, low core count CPUs, and that also kinda shows today, as we're using high settings with TAA enabled at 1080p resolution, and we got an average frame rate of 86 frames per second with a 1% low of 73. It's still a very smooth experience, but once you start overclocking it, it didn't really hold up to it, to be honest. We still got a small but noticeable increase, but in everyday usage you're not really gonna notice it. The graphics card is still the bottleneck here. Moving on to Battlefield 5, which can be quite demanding on anything lower than 6 threads, and that shows today. As at stock speed, we got an average frame rate of 71 with a 1% low of 32 at high settings with 1080p resolution. Overclocking it to 4.3 GHz, at the averages it didn't really look that much of a difference, as I literally got less than a 0.5% increase. But the 1% low did definitely got us the upper end at 48 frames per second. I would like to note that yes, this game was a lot smoother once I started to overclock the CPU. And a newly introduced game that I otherwise have left forgotten was Jurassic World Evolution, which is a actually pretty fun game if you like to be a little bit more of a patient roller coaster tycoon type of stuff. But it is extremely demanding, especially the save game I have chosen for my benchmarks. At high settings at 1080p resolution, I got an average frame rate of 35.3 and a 21 FPS 1% low. However, overclocking the CPU, we got almost to the mid 40s in the averages and a 1% low of just under 30. Honestly, I can perfectly fine play this game, but I will probably see if I can maybe stress the GPU a little bit more, except for the rain obviously, and see if I can get a little bit more of an enjoyable experience. However, if you're using a smaller park with not that many guests and dinosaurs and all that, usually it will scale up the frame rate to, I would assume, in the mid 50s perhaps. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019 at medium and high settings at 1080p resolution, we got an average frame rate of actually it's not too bad, 62 FPS with a 1% low of 40. However, overclocking the CPU, we got a pretty decent boost in performance, as we got up to 74.1 FPS average with a just under 50 FPS 1% low. And last but certainly not least, we have Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, which can be very taxing on even lower end hardware. Here I had to scale down to medium settings with FXAA enabled with 1080p resolution, and I got an average frame rate of just under 48 frames per second and a 1% low of a pretty poor 24 FPS. However, overclocking the CPU to 4.3 GHz, we got a significant boost up to 63 FPS average with a 1% low of 33 frames per second. Overall, it seems that overclocking the CPU, we not only are gaining a lot percentage-wise in 1% low performance, but it also seems that this CPU is actually pretty easy to overclock, but I will talk more about that in the camera. Speaking of that, back to the camera. So there you have it. Those were the benchmarks for the Core i5-760. How do I feel about it? Since most games today, they actually don't really like strictly quad-core CPUs. They usually prefer something like an 8-thread or even 12-threaded CPU. I really feel like this one was a pretty strong CPU considering its age. I mean, if I were to take a Core 2 quad CPU, I'm pretty sure that I could not run maybe half of the games that I showed you guys today, and it will run a hell of a lot slower. It will be way more difficult to cool. It will be more difficult to even achieve 4 GHz. Not impossible, but I'm speaking from personal experience. And although the motherboards are more readily available for LGA 775 setups, they are usually running on pretty outdated technology. Is the Core i5-760 worth buying today? That's really difficult because that depends a lot on how much you paid for this CPU and with a motherboard. Yes, you can go out and get yourself an OEM motherboard. I'm not gonna be too mad about that. But you can really gain a lot of performance when you start to overclock it. And that really shows us that 970 was being bottlenecked by the CPU, which is totally fine. I expected that 100%. But it really shows us that this CPU can still put up a relatively decent fight when it was being overclocked to, say, 4 GHz, for example, which should be absolutely no problem to get on air cooling. So if you can get, let's say, a P55 chipset motherboard, if you can get this for less than $60, I would say, you can definitely get it to work. Now that of course doesn't include DDR3 memory, but since you can get that on eBay or AliExpress for very reasonable money, I think like $20-25, you should easily be able to get 8 GB of non-garbage memory. That could definitely work out. Now in terms of graphics card recommendations, this is more to you that are still using this Linfield based Core i5 CPU, which by the way I am happy to hear that you have used the same product for 10 plus years. That is very good for the economy, especially your own economy, and for the environment, because you don't need to buy some new expensive crap just because it has a new sticker on it, if you know what I mean here. Now, if you're running at stock speeds, okay, you know, those 3.2 GHz all-core speed, and you're perfectly happy with it, I would say a GeForce GTX 1050 will be a very good pairing for it. I don't think you can push it much further than that, and anything equivalent with it, such as the RX 460, 560, GTX 950, or the the GTX 760 GPU I meant. That will be a very good pairing with this CPU without an overclock. If you have overclocked the CPU, say 4.1, 4.2 GHz or maybe even more than that, then your graphics card selections are way better. I would say you can get something like a GTX 1050 Ti or GTX 960 2 or 4 GB. An RX 570, I guess you can kind of squeeze it in there. It's kind of on the edge, but you can definitely get it to work. Or an Radeon R9 380 series graphics card, or hell, even a Radeon 7970, which will be a great pairing for this CPU, especially with overclocking. Now, if you want to upgrade this CPU to something a little bit more powerful, because you're not quite committed to do a full system upgrade or just changing out literally everything, such as the RAM, motherboard, and CPU, I would say get yourself a Core i7-860 CPU. But yeah, if you're still happy with your Core i5-760 and you haven't overclocked it, try to give it a quick 4 GHz overclock and perhaps upgrade the graphics card and make sure you have at least 8 GB of DDR3 memory at around 1333, 1600 MHz with nice timings, and you will be blown away how much performance it still has over 10 years after its release. So that's all for now. I hope you liked the video. If you did, like the video. If you didn't, dislike the video. Subscribe today if you absolutely loved it. Let me know in the comments down below. Are you still using this Core i5-760, or if you had in the past, let me know down below what you think about it. Anyways, you're very welcome to check out my social medias in the description, such as my Discord server and my Facebook page. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks for watching.